Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Anna Donnelly. I am a services product manager here at Insight, and I specialize in Microsoft Modern Work. I am here with Joe. Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So Joe Flynn, director of our Modern Workplace area of expertise here at Insight. Nice. Thank you for asking me to join in.
Absolutely. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Copilot Studio. Build was a couple of weeks ago, and we've been receiving a lot of questions about Copilot Studio, about what it is, what it's not. There's a lot of confusion out there. So, as we like to do, let's clear a few things up, beginning with what is Copilot Studio? So, Joe, you want to walk us through this just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think many people don't realize that Copilot Studio has been around for a few years now. So the previous name for Copilot Studio is what they call Power Virtual Agents. So it was part of the Power Platform, and it was a chatbot authoring tool. It was a low-code, no-code means of creating a chatbot. And with, I'm going to say legacy Power Virtual Agent, when you created these chatbots, you ultimately had to understand the entire conversation. So you're going to prompt the user for specific responses, or you're going to ask the user for specific inputs. And you can do it within the form of adaptive cards and many other things. The nice thing about legacy Power Virtual Agents is based on what the user selects or based on what the user types, you can then tie it into things like Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, whatever automation you want in the background, and or data validation that you wanted in the background. But again, you still had to fully understand what the user was going to type and ultimately what was your response going to be based on the actions you were performing of the user. So it was very prescriptive. Now, as we progressed into the world of AI, they've now renamed it from Power Virtual Agents to Copilot Studio. But now they have all that great capabilities of the legacy Power Virtual Agent, but now with the capabilities of natural language or AI capabilities, generative AI. So I don't no longer have to worry about, do I understand specifically what the user is asking? Because if what they're asking doesn't fit into my actual prescribed conversation, then we can leverage AI to go look elsewhere. And that elsewhere could be a website, could be SharePoint, OneDrive. It could be files that you upload into the agent or chatbot capabilities. And then it can provide responses based on the natural language that the user's typing, but more importantly, also a natural language response back to the user. So it's drastically improved, but you got to keep in mind, underlying capabilities, it's still a chatbot at heart. So you're going to prompt whatever you create, you're going to publish. You're still going to, the user's going to have to type something to initiate it. So you're going to still understand those capabilities. But again, it allows you to be very prescriptive, but more importantly, also allows you from a Copilot Studio standpoint to narrow down your focus on what data the responses are coming from. So understanding with Microsoft 365 Copilot, right, it leverages the entire graph at that point in time. So your emails, help me, Anna, emails, chats,
meetings,
everything within the graph or Office 365 ecosystem. That's good and bad, because since it does use emails and it does use chats, data hygiene, source of authority for data, that's all sometimes can get a little sketchy. So with Copilot Studio, if you want to be very specific on which data you want sourced for specific questions and answers, this allows you to really limit the data source for what users can potentially ask.
So help me understand then, because I feel like whenever we see something like this from a builder and it's Ignite or something like that, a lot of times what we're seeing is not what's available to us today. So are there some kind of guardrails on or limitations on what we can do today versus perhaps what we saw a little bit of in from build?
Yeah, if you look at the true capabilities today, right, we can extend the generative AI, that they call it, within Copilot Studio. And they give you the three options today, right? One is you can put in a public website, very simple to do. As soon as you can do it, and it gives it time to index, you can start just asking questions about it within your chatbot. The other option is SharePoint and OneDrive. And there's caveats there because you can point it to a SharePoint or OneDrive, but your URL can only be 2 levels deep. So if you want to go to a very specific document library within SharePoint or OneDrive, not possible. You can go to a SharePoint site, right? But you can't go down to the level of document library. And the same with OneDrive. You can go your OneDrive, high-level OneDrive, but you can't go to a specific folder at that point. The other gotcha with SharePoint and OneDrive, people understand, and it's not a gotcha, but I'm hoping that Microsoft does change it in the future, is for SharePoint and OneDrive to work, you have to go into Azure and create an app registration for this application to authenticate into your environment. So you got to create a custom app registration for Copilot Studio to leverage SharePoint and OneDrive in regards to authentication of the user who's going to be using it. Then the other option ultimately is just uploading files, right? So like I said, you can upload, I think it's around 10 or 15 files into the chatbot. So directly upload into chatbot, it'll index right within that Copilot Studio that you create. And then at that point in time, you can ask questions just on those specific documents. So those are the three options today. But I think what we saw announced was a ton of capabilities, right? Because now almost every SharePoint site will have its own Copilot. Yeah. Users will ultimately be able to now click to create a Copilot from SharePoint. So even if you want to select multiple documents within a document library, there'll be an option just to click and create a Copilot. We also have the thing about agents coming soon. And see, we have it in the bottom of the slide, where the benefit, and Microsoft has touted this numerous times. This year, Copilot is more about summarizing, maybe creating documents, those type of things, right? It's got very basic functionality. What we're going to see come the end of this year, next year, is Copilots and the AI capabilities is going to be more driven towards automation. So it's not what I can get out of it when I ask. It's ultimately what can it do for me on its own, so I don't have to worry about asking it in the future. And I think that's where the agents is coming in, leveraging the capabilities of Power Virtual Agent and the other connectors that are going to be built into Copilot Studio to now just take automated actions. Like if an email comes in, and if the email possibly contains various phrases or anything in that regard, I want you to automatically just do this. So you don't have to be very prescriptive on, hey, I'm looking for a keyword in the email. If the email just somewhat contains this type of phrase, then ultimately you can have actions done upon that. Very basic scenario, but you can start seeing the automated capabilities that can be done as time goes on.
And my understanding is that it's not even going to be out of preview until November. So if you're, looking to test its capabilities against perhaps, like a custom AI solution, there's not much of a competition if you're doing some kind of a bake-off, right? Do we want to use Copilot Studio versus do we want to use, Azure AI Studio, something like that? So November is when it will be out of preview. They've not necessarily announced when some of these things like the agent capabilities, I think it said by the end of the calendar year, whatever that happens to mean as well. So just some things to keep in mind as you go through this. The other thing too, if you are going to point it at documents today, so it's very, you're feeding it documents, are there some limitations around that as well? I mean, you can't feed it like 100-page documents, right? It's got to be relatively simple.
The limitation is if I recall, the limitation was 3 meg per document. So a document can't be over 3 meg, which is not very big. I mean, if we're talking about text, 3 meg is a lot. If we're talking about text, if you're talking about documents with graphics and other things, or PowerPoints can be huge. 3 meg is not a lot. So yeah, 3 meg is a limit today in regards to uploading documents directly into it for use of that indexing and usage right away. Now, keep in mind, like if I upload documents, the indexing is really quick, right? And extremely quick at that point. If you're leveraging a SharePoint site, you're going to have to give it time to index. So if you think you're going to create a Copilot and point it to a SharePoint site and hit publish, and then within seconds, you're going to start, hey, I get to ask questions about it. This is awesome. Probably not going to work. So you probably have to give it a couple hours to index whatever site or sites that you end up connecting it to for that purpose.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So here's just a few of the questions that we've received on more than one occasion in the last few weeks. And I started talking a little bit about this, but really, what are really the main differences between Azure AI Studio or really any, platform that you're going to build a generative AI solution on, and what we can do in Copilot?
Yeah, so how I like to explain this one is Copilot Studio is meant for the no-code, low-code capabilities, right? It's meant for ease. It's meant for that, let me consumable approach. So it's quick and easy, not quick and easy to create. It can get very custom, don't get me wrong, but out of the box, you can pretty much create your own Copilot within possibly a few clicks. Azure AI Studio, the complexity just it scales immensely, right? Because now you're talking about you select your LLMs, which there's 1,300 plus LLMs you select. You upload your data, you create your indexes, you prioritize your indexes. There's a ton you have to do in regards to, even from a UI perspective, right? How are they interacting with that Azure AI Studio that you're creating? Where from a Copilot Studio, like I said, it's built on a chatbot already because it's Power Virtual Agents. So your UX is already there for your users. The LLM you're using is native to whatever Microsoft is consuming today from a Copilot for Microsoft 365. So you're leveraging the same LLM. You don't have access to it. You're pretty much consuming that as a service. Your data that you supply, it's indexing automatically. So if you're leveraging just uploading files, it's going to use the Dataverse search. If you're using SharePoint or OneDrive, it's going to do basic Microsoft search indexing. But if the user is licensed for a Copilot for Microsoft 365, it will leverage the semantic indexing. So very simple. Like I said, a few clicks. At that point in time, I can publish it to Copilot for Microsoft 365. I can publish it for Microsoft Teams. On the Azure AI side, like I said, I'm picking between my LLM. I'm uploading the data. I'm curating the data. I'm understanding the security of the data. Understanding how it's indexing, prioritizing the indexes, creating the UX to ultimately interact with it. But then I got to publish that UX somewhere for users to use. So ultimately, it may or may not be within the tools that they're already using. So as you can see, the complexity can almost like you're going off the cliff at, right, in the Grand Canyon, because you're jumping into the world of purely custom. But and also, you got to look at a cost perspective. Copilot for Studio, and we'll get into the price points, but I mean, it can be fairly economical, and it's also tied to your Copilot for Microsoft 365 licensing. Azure AI Studio is consumption-based, so depending on how you create it, what you create, and how often it's used, you got to very be careful at times with the price points.
Yeah. So Copilot Studio is bringing essentially your developers and your infrastructure and a pre-baked LLM, and it's kind of getting you like maybe 80% of the way down the road, right? Whereas Azure AI Studio, if you're going to build it, it's that you're building it from scratch.
Correct.
Okay. Yep. Right. Okay, here's a fun one. So
just had this last week.
Yes. So first of all, let's talk about what these Copilot for finance, sales, and service are, because Microsoft these days are calling them biz apps. They're kind of putting everything that was under the Dynamics umbrella essentially is now biz apps because it's also able to connect with more than just Dynamics. So there are these solutions that are out there for finance, sales, service. I'm sure there are going to be more. Help us understand what those are first.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and you and I were just talking about this from a customer conversation, and same conversation we're having today. I was walking to a customer through Copilot Studio, and then their question back to me was, "Okay, great. If I can do all that in Copilot Studio, then why would I buy Copilot for finance, sales, and service?" Now, if we look at finance is Copilot ultimately that has connectors into things like an SAP and other financial tools to be able to automatically access that data. Sales connects into Dynamics and Salesforce. Service has ServiceNow capabilities, Dynamics capabilities, and the likes of others. So the question is, you can absolutely create this in Copilot Studio. So I mean, it could be difficult because you're going to have to use probably premium connectors. So you're going to have to pay for it. But I mean, again, with Copilot Studio, it's a chatbot engine. So you're going to have to ultimately understand what you're going to look for. What are some topics? What are some prompts? You can leverage natural language, but ultimately, where are you going to go based on the natural language response from the LLM perspective? You have to maintain those connectors. So even though those connectors are premium, you still have to maintain them. If they do break or if something goes wrong, you have to troubleshoot it. And so, I mean, that's where now we get into the question of Copilot for finance, sales, and service. If you think about it, these are ultimately like a Copilot Studio creation that Microsoft has did all the work for you. So they're creating very supportable connectors that they support and the other parties support. So whether it's Salesforce, ServiceNow, so they've already worked that supportability out. They thought of all of the topics. They thought of everything a potential user could ask. and ultimately what type of prompts and responses the user may want to get back into from an output perspective. So they basically took all that heavy lifting you would do from a Copilot Studio into these more advanced systems, and they did it for you. So it's in a more supportable fashion versus you having to do it yourself. Keep in mind, we talked the previous slide and how Copilot Studio is low code, no code. And we did mention things like a website, SharePoint, OneDrive, if you want to upload documents. But now we're getting into the complex portion of it. If you want to connect it into ServiceNow, you want to connect it into Salesforce, absolutely can be done. No different how you have the connectors from a Power Automate perspective. But then you're creating the connectors. Those connectors have to have specific configurations to access certain data, security context. And again, this is where now it's a very incremental increase that these Copilot for Finance, Sales, and Services come into play because Microsoft has thought through everything for you. And keep in mind, Copilot for Finance, Sales, and Service, and keep me straight here, they run at about $40 to $50 per user per month, MSRP. But that's not.
That includes Copilot for Microsoft 365, though.
That's what I was going to say. So it's not $40 or $50 per month plus $30 for Copilot for Microsoft 365. If you already have Copilot for 365, which is $30 today, then you're looking at an extra $10 or $20 for those very specific services. So when you start thinking through what should I use and how from a supportability perspective, you have to look at the cost to support once you start doing custom connectors and custom other things versus just taking something off the shelf where they thought through with the other partner, whether it's a Salesforce, a ServiceNow, or Dynamics, all the things and the capabilities that may be needed in that solution.
And my understanding of this as well is that there are agent capabilities that are already built in to Sales, Service, Finance. So it will do things like update your CRM. There's a lot of agent capabilities tied to Copilot for Finance. So it takes that, I think, does take a significant amount of work out of building your own Copilot, especially for something that's going to be used by a wider audience. Do you want to be responsible for that?
And I think you nailed it. I think this is just a start, like Copilot for Finance Sale. I think we're going to see a ton more Copilots in the future come out.
Yeah.
Where Microsoft may partner with these other third-party vendors that are your biggest tools used in organizations. And how can they create a very supportable solution, a very easy-to-use solution that's just ultimately plug and play, if you think about it. And if you're looking for Copilot for Sales, one of the big things with Salesforce is you can use your own authentication, as long as it's all enabled in your environment, right? Use your own credentials and authentication to connect into Salesforce for that purpose. So again, very off-the-shelf, easy to support, easy to use.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's talk about the license model. This one, I feel like there are so many things that we could talk about in regard to the license model for this, because we still are talking a little bit about Power Virtual Agents. We're talking about Copilot Studio. We are just going to talk about Copilot Studio right now. So if you are publishing standalone Copilots, right? So if you are doing exactly what Joe had said, where you're pointing it at a SharePoint site, and if you're going to publish it on a SharePoint site for everyone to use in your organization, so not just the folks who have Copilot for Microsoft 365, but everyone, that is going to require you to activate the Copilot Studio license for your tenant, which is $200 a month. And for that $200 a month, if you are creating Copilot, so using natural language, you get 12,500 messages a month. So every time I ask Copilot a question or I ask it to refine an answer, that would be the consumption of a message, right? So if you exceed that, then there are additional consumption charges based on the interactions of your end users. So in some cases, you'll be just fine with those 12,500 a month, right? You might be a smaller organization. Maybe it's a pointed solution that's for a particular group. Maybe they're consuming 500 or 200 messages a month, right? But as you start to expand that, if you are a larger organization, if you're like the thing that we hear about is all the time as the example is an HR bot that will look at all of the various documentation and give you a response. If you're creating an HR bot that's about your benefits or something like that, that's everybody in your company who's going to use it, right? So just know that there are consumption charges that are associated with that. And again, you have to activate that tenant license. So this is available to everyone today. If you have any Microsoft 365 licensing, this is something you just go in, enable in the tenant, and you can start building those copilots. Once you publish it, that's when the consumption messaging begins. Now, if you are developing plugins, which we didn't talk too much about, but we probably should, if you are going to develop a plugin that is specific to Copilot for Microsoft 365, that isn't going to cost you anything additional, right? So if it is something that I am including as part of a functionality in the Microsoft 365 chat, essentially, and there's going to be a lot of these, I think that will be available. That will not cost you anything additional beyond the Copilot for Microsoft 365 license. So Joe, where plugins are concerned, that's very specific functionality that can be accessed through the Copilot for Microsoft 365, applications or interfaces, correct?
Correct. And when we talk about the plugins, imagine that we talk about Copilot Studio this entire session. It's being able to take that Copilot Studio and publish it in Copilot for Microsoft 365. So the same UI, UX that the user is using for the rest of Copilot, they can now start interacting with what you create in that same experience. So if you think of the M365 chat, if in Teams, the M365 chat in the browser, or the other capabilities, the plugin can automatically show up in there. And again, the best part is once you have the plugin as far as prompts, like what types of prompts to listen to or look at, then you can automatically take actions within what you create within just a native Copilot for Microsoft 365. Now, just to jump back a second, what you said, Anna, on the first one, the standalones, just to avoid confusion, right? And you may be able to explain it better than I, but the Microsoft collateral says it's $200 a month for 25,000 messages.
Yes.
But right, correct me if I'm wrong, but once you implement the AI capabilities, then each request counts as 2 messages, and that's why we have the 12.5 there.
Yep. So if you have built chatbots using Power Virtual Agents and you're consuming licensing for that, you've already got this activated, and those legacy Power Virtual Agent chatbots, you can 25,000 and it consumes 1 message, whereas it's 2. We actually have a really good article about this. I will make sure that our folks include this in the chat, where it explains a lot more about the licensing than what we've got here, including some more information about how it applies to existing Power Virtual Agents, things like that. So it is a little bit confusing. So yeah, that's definitely something to note, is that when you look at the information about this site on Microsoft Learn or anywhere else, it's going to tell you 25,000, but it consumes 2 for natural language, for leveraging the LLM. Okay, so lastly, here we go. There are things that we need to worry about today, right? If you're playing around with Copilot Studio, or if you're really interested in the agent capabilities that are not there yet, before you turn this on, understand that there are some things that you probably want to pay attention to. This really kind of ties back to Power Platform governance, citizen development programs. I will say about Copilot Studio the same thing that we say about Copilot for Microsoft 365. There's a lot of stuff that we should have been doing all along. So, whether it's making sure your security and your data hygiene looks good in Microsoft 365, or making sure you have some governance around the Power Platform and the solutions and the apps that are getting built. These things, it's been important for some time, but now it's being highlighted by the addition of generative AI capabilities. So Help me understand why this is important, why Power Platform governance, which would include Copilot Studio, why that is important.
Yeah, I think keep in mind with no code, low code, I think we want to encourage users to do more. Right? It's available to them to do more to make their job easier, making more efficient, right? And improve productivity is all that key word we love to use. As Microsoft progresses with Copilot Studio, remember we already said earlier, every SharePoint site potentially would have a Copilot. You can create a Copilot with a few clicks based on documents. Or today, Copilot Studio, you can upload documents automatically into it and create a Copilot based on a few documents. I think what you're going to find is sprawl. You're going to find a ton of Copilots created by people once they get the fact how easy it is. But then you may get into the point of questioning what's the source of the data. If everybody can create a Copilot, everybody can upload files, everybody can potentially point it to a OneDrive. Now, when responses come in, I mean, we may very well get to the point of this is great response, but what was the source of data? Like, is it the correct source? Is it the right data? Is the response correct? And I think that's where the governance comes in. And I think it all goes back to data hygiene, data integrity. We have to totally understand. I mentioned previously, regular Copilot, we said, right, leverages the entire graph. And I do question the use of emails and Teams chats in regards to responses because, right, there's things we type in there that with a lot of times it's just could be misinformation. It could be us just trying to figure something out, right? But I mean, and that's why I think the benefit of Copilot Studio is I can say I want it only to this specific folder, which I know maybe as a published SharePoint site that I know data is it's finalized data, there's versioning and everything else in regards to it. But I mean, now it's great. I mean, I love the idea of being able to do all this, but you really have to start understanding like how the people are going to create it, what security contexts are going to be wrapped around it. Because the moment I create a Copilot Studio and upload documents, I can share that potentially with other users. Now the question is going to be, should they have access to the same documents? But then ultimately, like where's all this responses and the natural language responses getting the data from, and is it the right data? Let's always go back to that. Is it the right data that we want to get responses from? And you say it all the time about SharePoint versioning. Like people love to just create a copy of a file and edit it instead of allowing versioning from a SharePoint perspective. And the problem with that is Copilot will never know what is the latest version because there's going to be multiple copies of the same. But if SharePoint versioning was used or some type of versioning in that sense, right, then it would know what the latest is and ultimately where to pull the information from. But I mean, we've seen organizations, if you look at Power Automate, our virtual agents, or now Copilots, right? Copilot Studio or Copilots, they call them now. A lot of customers can have hundreds or thousands, depending how many users they have that are in their environment. So now you got to look at lifecycle management. If they're not being used, do you automatically archive them? Do you automatically delete them? What's the communication behind it? Is there a process you want to do to have users create them? Or guidelines you want to set before users create them to give them an understanding of, hey, we want you to think outside the box, right? We want you to leverage this technology, but we need to keep you in some form of an understanding of how it's going to work and what you have to think about throughout the entire process.
Yeah, and this is not to say, that we don't want to discourage end users from being part of this citizen development kind of movement, right? What I talk about with clients frequently is that, this is kind of just the next iteration of, the Excel spreadsheet, right? How many of how throughout your organization, you've got folks who are developing Excel spreadsheets using VB and now Python, right? So you have these little solutions that like exist out there that people are creating. This is the same thing, right? And a lot of IT organizations will look at this and say, I don't want to give this to my end users because I'm going to have to support it. If you set the right precedents and put the right controls in place to begin with, you won't have to, right? It's about putting those controls in place that say, we're using the right data sources, we're maintaining this in the appropriate way, and people are using it, right? You've already got these little weird solutions that are out there today. I mean, I talk to clients who still are using Access databases for stuff, right? That are being maintained in the business. So these things already exist, but now you've got visibility to it. And because you have visibility to it, that means that there could be liability associated with that as well. So deal with it now, while perhaps the deployment of this is relatively small, and empower your organization to kind of move into the 21st century, and develop solutions that are really efficient, that use modern technologies that could really improve efficiencies and productivity and creativity and all the things that Microsoft tells us and everybody else tells us AI is going to provide for us. So the other thing that I will say here as well is that we have been assisting clients with Power Platform governance, all the way from the life cycle to reviews of content and code and things like that. And we have also been helping with citizen development programs for years, right? This is, again, one of those things we've been doing it for years. So it now is the time to deal with that, and we'd love to have a conversation with you if you have questions about this. It certainly is something we can assist with. Joe, is there anything else you wanted to leave us with before we depart for today?
No, I think you nailed it. To be honest with you, like with the Power Platform, the low code, no code stuff. I mean, I started Power Automate just testing. Hey, I'm going to take a file from an email and automatically put it in a folder. I mean, that's just a very, very basic use case. And now I can tell you, I mean, we leverage it for API connectivity. I mean, we leverage it for a ton. And so even with customers we speak to them, and I spoke to customers from just in the Southeast, they managed like the town's pool, their town-wide pools and everything. And it was impressive to see like people thinking outside the box where they leverage Power Automate to tie into the weather. And if lightning was detected, then they automatically sent a notification to everybody in Teams who was their employees that regards to the pools. So they understood that, hey, this isn't so many miles away. You want to start considering preparing in case it gets closer. So again, encourage the users, because you're going to find, again, I nailed it. Everyone's doing this in some form or fashion. And unfortunately, many people still live in Excel. And I hate that. I hate the fact that many people would do. But I mean, this technology is here, but now it's centralized. It gives you the visibility. Yeah, it gives you the capabilities, but more importantly, it can help you grow and expand the business too. So 100% encourage this, because I think it's going to be great.